Webinar has started and it'll take folks about a minute to just trickle in.
Yeah. Yes. So, okay. I hope everyone is here now. We will start this webinar. So my name is Douw van Schie. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Bonn in Germany. I also work at UNU-AHS, United Nations University in Germany, and I will be the panel moderator for today. But actually, I will also present a little bit of an introduction to this panel, after which I will present you the panelists. So it will first be me speaking for about 5 to 7 minutes, and only then we will start with the actual panel, and I will introduce Stephen, Erica, and Lucy. So the reason that we chose to do an introduction is because, of course, this is a migration-related and new mobility-related online conference, but one of our core topics is loss and damage. And we thought, okay, perhaps it's quite good to start with a quick introduction of what loss and damage is and an introduction into the session. So indeed, I will quickly start with this. So again, very short, loss and damage. I think it's quite helpful if we talk about loss and damage to discern two different conceptualizations of it. And the first one is losses and damages in referring to impacts of climate change that have not been or cannot be avoided. What this really means is just realized climate impacts that have already happened. And on the second, we also have the political debate under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC. So on one side, you have the realized impacts, and on the other side, you also have loss and damage as a political object. So I will quickly elaborate on the second of this. So the UNFCCC is established in 1992 as the main global treaty framework to address climate change. Here, parties, so states basically annually meet at the Conference of Party meetings, the COPs, such as the one in Belém coming up soon, to negotiate collective responses. And the COP process is consensus-based, so all parties must agree, which gives every country basically a voice at the table. So when the UNFCCC started, which is in 1992, it's really started with mitigation, which means cutting greenhouse gas emissions to limit climate change. From the 2000s onwards, it shifted a little bit more to adaptation. So basically, adaptation was added as a second pillar, which basically means adjusting to climate impacts to reduce harm. And about 10 to 15 years ago, loss and damage was added as the third pillar. And loss and damage talks about addressing impacts of climate change that have not been or cannot be avoided. So these realized losses and damages. So it took a long, long way for loss and damage to be where it is right now. I will not go over this all, but as you can see here in 2022, the fund for loss and damage was established. And I quickly want to highlight this as I see this as basically the most important outcome of this 15 years of negotiating loss and damage under the UNFCCC. And the loss and damage fund is mandated to address loss and damage, to assist developing countries, and to respond to economic and non-economic loss and damage, on which I will talk a little bit further. So really to get finance to address those realized losses and damages. So to come back to these realized losses and damages. So the UNFCCC, they often dichotomize the concept of loss and damage. So they say you have economic loss and damage, which means that people or communities or states might, for example, see the loss of infrastructure, the loss of property, things that are quite easily to like value on a monetary scale. But there's also a lot of elements that are lost that are not valuable on a monetary scale or complicated to value on a monetary scale. Think about biodiversity, ecosystems, indigenous knowledge, health. And as you can see, human mobility is also part of this. You see it here as the third type of non-economic loss and damage. I have some critiques on this, so I don't think you can completely dichotomize this. But this is quite a popular model that you often see back in loss and damage discourse. So to expand a little bit on this part on human mobility, this whole typology comes from this technical paper, which was commissioned by the UNFCCC in 2013. It was written by Fankhauser et al., three environmental economists. And in this, they basically say human mobility is one main type of non-economic loss. Here you can see from that paper, this is the table, and here you can see these types of non-economic losses. So again, loss of life, loss of health, but also human mobility. But when they describe this, they say displacement is the clearest case of non-economic loss in the continuum of human mobility, as non-economic items such as security, dignity, and agency are impaired by displacement. So this idea of human mobility being a non-economic loss and damage has been copied into the literature on loss and damage as well. This is quite a prominent paper on intangible harm, which is quite similar to non-economic loss and damage. But here they say human mobility is the freedom or remain to or travel within one's territory. So this is really a different idea of human mobility, which is really about travel within one's territory, as opposed to kind of being related to displacement. But then again, they talk here later about displacement. They talk about forced migration. Sorry, this is actually the bigger version. I should have showed this first. And you see this also being used later, for example, in loss and damage assessments. So this is an assessment published in 2021 by McNamara et al., where also here human mobility is one kind of category that was identified in the existing literature. And in another paper, they say human mobility is the most prominent non-economic loss and damage theme discussed. So this is all about human mobility, but we see over time more and more papers coming in on specific forms of mobility. So there's this paper, for example, on migration as a response to loss and damage from sea level rise in vulnerable communities. Another paper, lessons from displacement on non-economic loss and damage. And you also see this, for example, with plant relocation from the impacts of climate change, the intersection between adaptation and loss and damage. So more and more work on kind of the intersection between human mobility related topics and loss and damage is coming up over time. And with this, I basically want to introduce our session. So as we've seen, mobility is broadly considered as a form of non-economic loss and damage. However, the different ways of how loss and damage connects to different types of human mobility remains quite scattered. Different definitions of human mobility exist. Human mobility is engaged in different manners, and in general, it remains quite underexplored. So in this session, we address this gap and explore what insights might be gained to analyze loss and damage across these various forms of human mobility, and really try to have a more holistic view on what loss and damage, how loss and damage is connected to human mobility. So we have three speakers today. I say a very holistic view. We do kind of put them a little bit apart, but we have a lot of time for the discussion, which we hope to make this very holistic. But we'll start with Stephen Myron. And Stephen Myron is a researcher and publisher working on human displacement, environmental mobility, and climate change adaptation. And his current research focuses on climate-related loss and damage, displacement, and durable solutions, partly in Bangladesh. Currently, he's a visiting fellow at the Refugee Law Initiative and a co-editor-in-chief of Researching Internal Displacement. Stephen will later talk about displacement. Then we will move on to Dr. Erica Bauer. Dr. Erica Bauer is currently the climate displacement researcher at Human Rights Watch, building on a decade of studying climate mobility and advocating for policies that better protect people's rights on the move. She's also affiliated to Stanford University and the Calder Center at the University of New South Wales. And then we finalize with a presentation by Dr. Lucy Tsabova, is a researcher and consultant specializing on human mobility and loss and damage in the context of climate change, currently a senior scientist at the University of Vienna, and also an associate research fellow at the University of Exeter. And Lucy will later talk about migration. So With this, I will end the introduction and I will hand it over to Stephen to start with the first presentation on displacement. Again, we will have quite some time, we hope, to do a discussion. So please, be prepared to ask some questions to our panelists.
Can you see my screen? Yes, great. Thank you, Dawe, and thanks and congratulations to Western Michigan University for this wonderful symposium. It is indeed a real privilege to be part of this. I'll be speaking today about displacement with an emphasis on protracted displacement. And in line with the theme of this panel, the potential value of applying a more holistic mobility and immobility lens to averting, minimizing, and finding solutions to displacement. My screen is frozen. There we go. My presentation will draw on qualitative field research undertaken over a 10-week period in late 2024 in 3 different displacement contexts in Bangladesh, one rural, one para-urban, and one urban. And the main research and advocacy project report was actually published last week. It's called Missing in Climate Action, Displaced Communities and the Search for Durable Solutions, a Bangladesh loss and damage case study. And I'd like to give a shout out to my research associates and co-authors, Tanjeeb and Duty. I believe they're attending this session. And the goal of the project was to foreground the voices of displacement affected people. And I think Duty and Tanjeeb did an amazing job of faithfully capturing those voices. So what does it mean to be displaced? Displacement shatters lives and communities, and it can be very hard to address and reverse the loss and damage associated with displacement. The ICJ, in their recent advisory opinion, referred to displacement as one of the most severe and far-reaching consequences of climate change. Walter Kalin said that displacement in the context of climate change is the human face of loss and damage. But displacement is also a legal category. And there are several frameworks that address displacement, most of them peripherally. But this one, the guiding principles on internal displacement, address it directly. And this rather wordy definition boils down really to these words. Internally displaced persons are people who have been forced or obliged to flee or leave their homes or places of habitual residence. So forced and obliged to flee. And these principles are applicable to all forms of displacement, including displacement in the context of climate change related to both sudden onset and slow onset climate change processes. The guiding principles derive their authority from international human rights law and from the fact that they have been integrated into many national and regional legal frameworks and mechanisms. They codify the human rights protections that IDPs are entitled to throughout the displacement cycle, through to what we now refer to as durable solutions. And they've been called a Bill of Rights for displaced people. And they define the obligations of states as duty bearers. So we have this human rights-based framework with legal authority that addresses, amongst other things, displacement in the context of climate change. Pretty great, right? The trouble is that in some countries, in fact, many countries, there is pervasive non-recognition of IDPs in practice, nothing beyond perhaps some initial displacement data. There are rarely mechanisms that actually register and track people displaced in the context of climate change in need of a durable solution, and therefore inadequate processes to deliver durable solutions. Looking at, looking at Bangladesh, I wonder if this is a problem of data, but I actually suspect it's more of a problem of political will and priorities. And I'm sympathetic when I say that, because this has a lot to do with cost and funding. Climate vulnerable developing countries with large displaced populations have huge and growing burdens. So we argue in the report for an expanded definition of duty bearers, and we believe that at this time the time is ripe for trying to advance this concept, given the ICJ's advisory opinion. So we have a growing protracted displacement crisis. There are many definitions. I prefer this one, situations in which IDPs are unable to take steps that allow them to progressively reduce the vulnerability, impoverishment, and marginalization they face as displaced people. I prefer it because it captures how the losses and damages associated with displacement make protracted displacement situations difficult to resolve. So now let's look at the relationship between loss and damage and displacement. Displacement can be triggered by loss and damage. For example, loss of land, livelihoods, and homes, intolerable risk to life. And these are quotes that came from our field research in this location, Pratnam Union. The storm took everything. Displacement is itself loss and damage, including loss of safety and security, separation from community, loss of culture and way of life, loss of livelihoods and access to services, adverse impacts on mental and physical well-being. We're living on this road, but whether the road will still be here next year or not is the real question. We are landless people. Our lives are extremely uncertain. And critically, when we look at protracted displacement, displacement leads to further losses and damage. For example, impoverishment, discrimination, impacts on vulnerable groups, long-term physical and mental health impacts. Like in this first quote, it's a reference to an erosive coping behavior that is way too common. Poverty is so common here that no one wants to accept that schooling could help. The inhabitants in this area are extremely hesitant to educate girls. And so erosive coping can lead to cross-generational impacts and lead to protracted displacement. So yeah, Bangladesh has a protracted displacement crisis, as many places do. And this is perhaps one of the more salient quotes from the interviews that we did. If you look attentively, you will notice a few people who have been living along the road for a very long time. The problem is silent because it's under-acknowledged. Many living in protracted displacement have been invisibilized in policy and programming. But of course, displaced people are not invisible if we shift our gaze, as this quote invites us to, we will see them. So this under-acknowledgement in policy and programming is really unfortunate because protracted displacement is not inevitable, and the loss and damage associated with displacement can be minimized and addressed. One of the important goals of our research was to spotlight promising programmatic interventions and policy mechanisms in Bangladesh that do have the potential to move people toward more lasting solutions. And we weren't disappointed. We found programming by NGOs that were beginning to transform the lives of people in protracted displacement, if not quite yet deliver the full solution. And we also highlight Bangladesh's fledgling national strategy on internal displacement management and its action plan, which are excellent, but they need to gain more traction across government and civil society. So this is the final section of my presentation, looking at the relationship between displacement and other mobilities and immobilities. What can we gain from looking at displacement more holistically? One of the reasons for the extent of loss and damage is the lack of rights supporting solution pathways for poor, marginalized, displaced people. No means to return, no means to settle well, no support made to make that happen, and insufficient personal finance and resources to do it autonomously. That's a really important point. People are too poor to find their own solutions, and this is why many find themselves stuck. On the left is a quote from somebody displaced in a rural area where we studied on an eroding riverbank. On the right, it's somebody in an urban informal settlement. And these were very common themes of feeling trapped after displacement and not being able to leave elsewhere. So we know that displaced people can face secondary displacement. They can also face subsequent involuntary immobility. And that contributes to mental anguish, a debilitating form of loss and damage. So displaced people can become involuntarily immobile. Involuntary immobile people can also become displaced. In one of the places where we did our research, Port Nagor Union, we interviewed people who had become involuntary immobile during Super Cyclone Amphan in 2020. And some had experienced displacement subsequent to that. As a result of the increased vulnerability and exposure that grew out of their involuntary immobility. In some ways, that's not too surprising because the loss and damage context of displaced and involuntarily immobile populations are often similar, and they're overlapping in terms of the challenges that the two groups face. And sadly, they share the same coping strategies and behaviors quite often, withdrawing children from school, forcing girls into marriage, taking on huge debt, being forced into dangerous and exploitative situations of debt-bonded labor migration. Now my final slide, which hopefully segues well to the other presentations and our panel discussion that will follow. This seems logical and straightforward, but I think it is still important to point out, and that displacement happens in the absence of preventative or restorative immobility and mobility options, i.e. choice. And that is, displacement happens in the absence of rights-affirming, well-supported, and consent-based ability, the ability to stay in safety and with dignity, or return in safety and with dignity, to migrate, to relocate in safety and with dignity, and to live well translocally. For the displaced communities we studied, these opportunities were absent. And that too is a policy challenge, but perhaps a policy opportunity. I'm finished, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Very quickly, maybe a question, because I thought maybe while we wait for Erica to set up, we could just do one quick question to you, to bridge. Is that okay with you, Stephen?
Yeah.
Because Paul asked two questions, I'll ask one of them. And one of the questions that Paul asked is, what do you think of ongoing digital cash transfers as an efficient approach supporting agency for climate displaced persons? So yeah, basically cash transfers as an efficient approach supporting the agency.
Two thumbs up. And really to tie that into the theme, which is the more holistic view, looking across that example that I just gave of involuntarily immobile populations and displaced populations sharing common challenges in common loss and damage contexts, and turning to erosive coping behaviors. That happens because of a lack of financial support in the aftermath of displacement, that erosive coping behavior. So I absolutely believe that quick cash transfers in the aftermath of an event before erosive coping sets in is absolutely key. And I think we'll talk about that when we get to our larger discussion on general policy implications.
Yes, thank you so much, Stephen. But I hope your answer is your question is answered. Also for the rest, if you then, for example, have a quick question for Erica, I think it makes sense to do a quick transition question. So feel free to type on in the chat. And with this, I give it to Dr. Erica Bauer, who will talk a little bit more about loss and damage and planned relocation.
Thank you so much, Dawe, and thank you so much, Steve, for that excellent presentation. So today I'll draw on some observations from working on various forms of human mobility and climate change contexts over the last decade. From my doctoral research, which focused specifically on this one form of climate mobility, planned relocation, as well as from one specific case study of planned relocation from my work with Human Rights Watch over the last 3 years. So on the screen here, you see the island of Gardisagdub in Panama, where Guna indigenous people have loved their island home for several hundred years. Yet life was hard because there was no space and because sea level rise and annual floods threatened their access to drinking water, sanitation, and education. And as a result, back in 2010, the community made a challenging decision of planning a collective relocation to a safer site on the mainland. We'll talk more about challenges that remain and also the fact that they have now moved to the mainland throughout the course of this presentation. But first, let's zoom out a bit to some broader conceptual framing and background. So as we've heard from Dawe, human movements related to climate change take various forms. There is a range from forced to voluntary, a range from temporary to permanent. Of the 3 types of movement that were introduced by the Cancun Adaptation Framework back in 2010 in paragraph 14F, planned relocation is perhaps the most understudied and has received the least attention. It's also unique for several reasons. It's permanent, unlike evacuations. It takes place at this community-wide scale, and it often involves coordination or assistance from a supporting actor, often a government, leading to unique governance challenges and unique implications in terms of today's conversation about loss and damage. There are many terms that are often used to describe this phenomenon: relocation, resettlement, retreat. They're often used across contexts, languages. For today's presentation, we're defining planned relocation as having 6 core elements. It's planned, it's a permanent movement, so it's not an evacuation, and it involves a whole group of people moving from an identifiable place of origin to an identifiable site of destination. So not an individual household buyout where people can move to different sites. And it takes place predominantly in association with one or more natural hazards. So we're not thinking about resettlement linked to development projects, for example. It's generally internal, it's generally carried out under the authority of the state, and populations are, in ideal circumstances, given access to conditions to rebuild their lives and livelihoods in the new site. There are many different definitions, as I mentioned, and we're sharing this not because it's the right definition, but because it's useful for identifying empirical evidence in concrete cases. So drawing on that definition, a 2021 global mapping published by the Calder Center and the Platform on Disaster Displacement that was conducted by myself and Sandrula Weerasinghe identified over 400 cases of this community-wide relocation across all inhabited continents. So we see that planned relocations are already happening, and this is a global phenomenon. That number 400 is likely an underestimate. There are many other cases that were not documented in the literature review. And we see from that analysis that when well planned, planned relocations can be a way of avoiding some of the high emotional, social, and economic costs of forced displacement that Steve mentioned in his presentation. In some circumstances, it can be a durable solution for disaster IDPs. But when we looked to that case study evidence, we also found that planned relocations are often initiated after the population has been before the population has been displaced. So it can also be a way of preventing future displacement. And finally, there are some circumstances where planned relocations may constitute a form of internal displacement when there is no consent and people are made to relocate against their will. So a quick tangent, because we're having this discussion about many forms of climate mobility and how they relate to loss and damage. In planned relocations, there are multiple sources of force, and David Cantor articulates three. There is the driver in the place of origin, for example, that flood. There is the nature of the relocation process itself, for example, authorities demolishing homes. And then there's the conditions in the place of origin after a relocation has already happened. Scenarios such as a community called Walande that I've been working with in Solomon Islands, where the island no longer exists. I argue that the first and third category will always exist in planned relocations that are related to climate change, but that second category varies, and that's the key distinction for whether a planned relocation constitutes forced eviction or internal displacement. According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the need for these types of planned relocations will already increase. So this is a global phenomenon, and it's likely to happen more as climate change renders more places uninhabitable. We need to take this challenge seriously. International actors are already developing guidance. You see here guidance that was developed back in 2015, exactly 10 years ago, Toolbox developed in 2017, and other instruments about this unique form of climate mobility that have been developed. National governments are also paying attention. You see here a couple examples of national policies that focus on this challenge in Fiji and Solomon Islands, but the framing varies greatly across these policies, in part because planned relocations have this anticipatory and a reactive element. We see planned relocation is framed by different governments, sometimes as an issue of internal displacement, prevention, or durable solution. In other circumstances, it's framed as disaster risk reduction or response. In other circumstances, it's framed as either climate change adaptation or an issue of loss and damage. And really, that's our focus today. So, in the literature around these topics, a question often arises: is planned relocation an adaptation measure, or is it an issue of loss and damage? And therefore, which fund under the UNFCCC should be approached by these relocating communities? The adaptation fund or the loss and damage fund that Dawe mentioned earlier? In reality, planned relocations often occur at the threshold where the limits to adaptation have been reached. What this means in practical terms is that it's framed as at the intersection of both adaptation and loss and damage, as the authors of the two articles highlighted here argue. So it's often framed as a simple equation: planned relocation equals loss and damage. But as we've already heard, it's a bit more complicated than that. And here I'll outline multiple ways that planned relocation and loss and damage are related, which of course vary across context and time. So the first way, which is perhaps the most obvious, is that loss of land and habitability due to challenges like sea level rise and coastal erosion can make planned relocations a necessary response. So consider again that community of Gardi Sugdub in Panama. Loss of space, and also coastal hazards such as floods threatened adequate standard of living for current and future generations, causing losses and threatening rights to adequate housing, health, sanitation, access to potable water, education. The school is quite literally falling into the sea, but also challenges around traditional livelihoods such as fishing. Here is a map that a community leader drew for me when I visited back in 2023, and you can see that sea level rise and annual floods are threatening many parts of the island. When I spoke to a student leader, she described to me how the sea is eating the land beneath our homes, and therefore making planned relocation necessary as this measure of last resort. After which, this community began to plan their relocation to the mainland. Many of the community chose to stay and are choosing to stay for as long as they can on their island because of inheritance of homes, livelihoods that are deeply tied to the island around fishing, deep attachment to this place that's familiar, but also in some circumstances because they had no other choice. One woman who I spoke to who has a disability chose to stay in her hammock, but was very afraid of what would happen when her caretaker moves to the mainland. What's going to happen to communities or members of the community that lack the support systems after the community becomes divided in this way. Some community members also continued translocal existences where they move back and forth between this island you see pictured here and their new site on the mainland. And these populations, both those who are translocal and those who choose to stay, also are facing considerable losses and damages. Planned relocations themselves, especially when there's not adequate consent and support, can lead to loss and damage. These are really complicated processes. They're time consuming, they're costly, and there are serious risks. There's loss of traditional livelihoods, connection to ancestral lands and cultures, loss of languages, social cohesion. Here's a quote from one community leader who feared that once this planned relocation has taken place, many of the children will forget Laguna Indigenous language and culture and livelihoods will change dramatically. And perhaps even this culture of helping one another might be eroded. At the same time, some community members described to me how they see how planned relocation might reduce some of the losses and damages, especially when it's well supported, consent-based, and participatory. So you can see here the new site on the mainland called Esperiala. It's safer from sea level rise, and it also has a Casa de Congreso, Casa de Chicha made in the indigenous style. And there's really been a lot of efforts to preserve indigenous curriculum. And some see this as a choice, and that in the process of designing their planned relocation, they can choose to not lose their identity, to maintain their customs, to remember their Guna identity through the design of this planned relocation site and reduce some of the losses and damages by design. There are also some circumstances where climate change impacts undermine the effectiveness of planned relocation. So this is a different case study in the Maldives where, oh, thank you. I'll try to keep this quick. We see that because sea level rise is happening in the year 2100, the new site that people have moved to, a different island, may face threats very similar to their place of origin in the upper left corner. So climate change impacts are undermining the effectiveness of planned relocation. Not all planned relocations are the same, and conflating these different cases under one label can have serious consequences, including for understanding the relationship with loss and damage. So here's a conceptual framework documenting some of the variation on two axes: level of consent on the x-axis and level of support on the y-axis. So cases of planned relocation where there's high support and consent may be more likely to be a response to loss and damage and a reducer of loss and damage. Whereas cases in the lower left corner where there's low consent and low support may be more likely to cause losses and damages. And we need community access for funds to have more consent-based and well-supported planned relocations. I'll also just highlight quickly that the level of support and consent can change over time, and so therefore can the relationship between loss and damage and planned relocation. Here's that example of loss and damage in Gardi Sagdub. And I'll just conclude with how loss and damages may be to some extent inevitable. This is a line from the Casa de Congreso in the Guna, the meeting house on the island of Gardi Sagdub. It says, people who lose their traditions lose their soul. To some extent, the ultimate goal of planning relocation is to reduce loss and damage, moving towards that upper right corner of the matrix from the previous slide. It may not be possible to fully eliminate, but we can reduce. So then rather than asking if planned relocations are loss and damage in a very simplistic equation, maybe the more important question to ask is how we reduce these losses and damages through relocation planning. And I'll just highlight very quickly that the extent of loss and damage really depends on how strong policy frameworks are, and whether human rights protections are embedded. So we need policy frameworks that are community-centered, that have human rights protections, particularly the right to culture and self-determination, to limit these losses and damages. And one good practice that's coming from Panama, a national protocol is being developed as we speak. It's a first step. And eventually every country with a coastline will need to take these challenges seriously, because after all, to plan to fail to plan is to plan to fail. Thank you. And sorry for going a little bit over.
No problem, Erica. Thank you so much. I don't see a question at the moment pointed to Erica. Maybe I will quickly ask one while Lucy can then set up her her screen. My question, Erica, is because we talked about loss and damage fund. I know that there's very little money in the loss and damage fund, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the costs of planned relocation, that are involved with planned relocation.
Yeah, that's a complicated question. We've seen some relocations that have been costed at $1 million, others $100 million. There's a huge range. There's a recent study that was just launched called Funding Futures, which really dives into this question in greater depth, and I'd encourage you all to read. I think this is the key question to be asking as we start to articulate more clearly what planned relocations as loss and damage, or in the context of loss and damage, actually look like. Happy to talk more about this later.
Yes, fantastic. Yeah, and before we go to Lucy, I see that Stephen, you also answered some questions in the Q&A, so this is also possible. If someone wants to ask a quick question, we can also just answer them by typing. And with that, I will give it to Dr. Lucy Sabova, who will now talk about the last topic, which is migration. I see you're trying to unmute yourself. No worries.
I have done it now.
Yeah, great.
So sorry. Okay, let me see. Okay, can you see my screen okay?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, cool. So thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you again to the organizers for organizing this great event. So I'm going to be talking about the third type of mobility, migration, and the links with loss and damage, exploring this through a relational immobilities lens. And I suppose, again, just to set the scene, like my colleagues have just done, just to sort of explain migration in this context. So migration is essentially seen as an autonomous form of adaptation, so something that is undertaken by households in response to the impacts of climate change. And in terms of being framed as an adaptation strategy, it's also kind of represents a narrative shift from negative perceptions of migrants and migration, really highlighting migrants as agents, migration as a opportunity rather than a problem, and as an adaptation rather than a failure to adapt in places of origin. And through these positive kind of reframings of migration, I suppose there is also a danger of emphasizing the mostly kind of positive economic benefits. So very often remittances are highlighted, and it impacts on livelihood diversification, etc. And maybe there is a certain underemphasis of non-economic consequences that are also part and parcel of migration, as we will see in a moment. And of course, there's a shift in responsibility as well. The responsibility being shifted to households to adapt, and the lack of supporting programs and policies to make that adaptation successful. And then this, of course, also increases the risk of loss and damage in the context of migration. So in this presentation, I'd like to explore this link between migration and loss and damage, and in particular, how loss and damage in the context of migration is experienced at the intersection of migration, immobility, but also other forms of mobilities. that my colleagues have covered. So first of all, migration is very often, and Dawe also showed that paper, is framed as a response or a symptom of loss and damage. So people are responding to realized loss and damage, especially in the context of resource-based livelihoods, where perhaps the viability of those livelihoods is increasingly undermined, and therefore people are seeking opportunities elsewhere, for instance, very often in cities. As we know, most of migration in the context of climate change takes place within countries rather than across borders. And also loss and damage shapes migration decisions and capabilities. So rather than just sort of seeing this as a sort of one-way relationship of loss and damage equals migration, it can also lead to immobility. So where people may have the desire or the need to move to adapt to changing climatic and environmental conditions that are impacting their livelihoods, they may not be able to do so. And there's been research showing how, in particular, sort of slowly unfolding changes and impacts of climate change are gradually eroding the resources needed for people to move, as well as loss and damage due to climate change may be intervening with the livelihoods and the mobilities or the ability to move of previously mobile populations. So thinking about transhuman and nomadic pastoralists who might be forced to settle and adopt entirely different livelihoods. And then, of course, with that, they lose much more than their mobility. They lose their identity tied to their livelihood. It also comes with immense psychosocial impacts as well. For instance, when they have to settle in cities and undertake work that they previously wouldn't have. And of course, and this is also an interesting kind of direction as well. So we very often think about realized losses and damages and how they might be shaping migration or the lack of it thereof. But there is also evidence which is now pointing in the direction that also anticipated losses and damages, which very often tend to be non-economic in nature, are shaping people's decisions about migration and immobility. So people are weighing essentially realized and anticipated losses and damages against each other in this process, potentially resisting or delaying migration. However, with that becoming exposed again to the risk of migration under distress later on, or even forced displacement in the future. And then, of course, migration can itself be also a source of loss and damage. So we've done work with colleagues at the University of Exeter over a few years in Bangladesh with migrants in cities. And this work has very clearly showed that in effect, migrants, when they move into cities, they experience a so-called risk exchange. So they replace one set of risks or hazards with a different set in cities. And these include environmental, social, economic types of hazards, including, as we see in the first image here, and hopefully you can read the quote. So this was from photo voice work with migrants in the city. So all the photos are taken by participants. People are essentially exposed to regular inundation due to waterlogging, which is impacting their living quarters. And then, of course, that's causing, not just health hazards in terms of, physical health, infections, etc., but also a lot of distress. So here, of course, we can see that people are also very powerless in terms of responding to these. So these have, of course, then impacts of multiple dimensions of well-being and lead to the loss of well-being in the context of migration. And then migration-related loss and damage can also elevate the risk of involuntary forms of mobility and immobility. So living on marginal land in cities, as we see here on the hill slopes of Chattogram, for instance, in informal settlements, unplanned informal settlements, very often people are at risk of being displaced For instance, here in the context of landslides during monsoon season. Of course, every time people are displaced or forced to move, they are losing more and more. So they are losing the social ties they may have forged. They are losing the very little assets that they may have accumulated. And of course, again, there is immense trauma involved in these kinds of movements. And then, of course, there's also the risk of involuntary mobility or becoming, so to speak, trapped in places of destination where people are unable to return home or to move onward to safer places, and thus facing ongoing losses and damages such as those that we've seen on the previous slides. And then importantly, for those who stay behind in places of origin, losses and damages are very often experienced at the intersection of migration and immobility through cascading loss and damage impacts. So for instance, this is just an example. There may be a breakdown in social cohesion within communities due to out-migration, which then can lead to the abandonment of the maintenance of communal infrastructures or access to land and resources. For instance, when women stay behind who don't have land titles or are not kind of included in decision-making about communal resources. And of course, these can all have then cascading impacts on livelihoods, water security, food security, etc. So then kind of coming to the last sort of part of my presentation. So what kind of lessons or insights can we learn in terms of averting, minimizing, addressing loss and damage in the context of migration and with regard to also other forms of mobility and immobility? So before painting too stark a picture, migration can also help reduce loss and damage. So as we've heard in the earlier presentations, well-supported migration as adaptation can also help avert future displacement and involuntary mobility. However, this requires addressing the very structures and conditions that currently lead to loss and damage in the context of migration, addressing exclusionary policies and planning that foreclose access to services and lead to a loss of well-being, for example, enabling safe and dignified pathways for migration that do not reproduce colonial and racist legacies that view migrants as merely sources of cheap labor, but ones that are rooted in the principles of climate justice. And of course, as we heard from Erica as well, as similarly in the context of migration, some migration-related losses and damages can be avoided, and that can be achieved through, as I mentioned, policies that are so for instance, policies on adaptation and mitigation planning, urban plans and policies, but also the emerging loss and damage policies that countries are formulating and integrating migration and mobility considerations into these, as well as integrating considerations of loss and damage into migration policies, programs, and interventions. And finally, also acknowledging that some migration-related loss and damage is going to be unavoidable, or as Erica said, inevitable. And I've got this quote here from Siri Eriksson and colleagues, which basically states that no adaptation decision is without consequences. Trade-offs are inevitable and are rarely evenly distributed. And this is also true in the context of migration and adaptation. So it is important, therefore, to recognize migration as a source of loss and damage in UNFCCC processes, and with that also enable pathways to accessing funding to loss and damage finance to support responses to these unavoidable losses and damages in the context of migration. And with that, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity again to present and look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. I'll also ask you a quick question. So on one hand, you're talking about migration as adaptation. At the other hand, you're also talking about migration being unavoidable. So what does this really mean then for the idea as migration as adaptation?
So losses and damages being unavoidable in the context of migration. Yes, so I think indeed it's kind of, it feels like a bit of an oxymoron, right? So adaptation and then loss and damage within that. So I think it's important to kind of highlight these losses and damages in the context of migration, to take a much more, I guess, critical lens at evaluating what migration as adaptation can or cannot deliver, and in terms of also evaluating its success and recognizing its limits, at which maybe we might transgress to other sort of rights violating types of mobility, as we've seen. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Lucy. And we will go deeper into this, I suspect, in the panel discussion, because there are some questions on adaptation, loss and damage. Anyways, I want to start maybe first with my own question. So I said I was going to ask you all, in preparation of this, I said I'm going to ask a policy-related question. I'm not going to ask a policy-related question. I changed my mind. So I made up an impromptu question. So I made some lists, and I tried to check a little bit all the links between the types of human mobility and loss and damage. So we have displacement triggered by loss and damage, displacement is loss and damage, displacement leads to further loss and damage can cause plant relocation can cause loss and damage, plant relocation can reduce loss and damage, migration can be a source of loss and damage, migration-related loss and damage. Yeah, we also talk about this. So there are a lot of links we have explored. Of course, the idea of this session is to be holistic, and we have been quite fragmentary until now. So maybe what I will ask each of the panelists is to quickly talk about why do we think it's so important to talk about this in a holistic view, and how do you see this exactly? So maybe we can just start with Stephen, and then we go to Erica, and then we go to Lucy.
Yeah, thank you. Well, to come back to a couple of the observations that I shared of mobilities in practice are not siloed. They're not different. We use these phrases, we use these words. Displaced people were not previously displaced, right? Involuntarily immobile people were not involuntarily immobile, and both groups would prefer to be something other than their current status, and hope to transition to a situation where they're no longer displaced or no longer involuntarily. So we need to talk about these things. On a very practical note, I think if we can talk about them, we can create more effective programming. Programming that meets the needs of many people across different types of mobility contexts, and ultimately supports mobility choice. So I would look for those synergies, if you will, so that the investments that we make in helping people ultimately are more effective and deliver choice, so that people can actually choose their own mobility futures and change them, should they wish to change them.
Fantastic. Thank you, Stephen. Erica, do you have anything to add to this?
Yeah, a lot of what you just shared resonates, Steve. I think one of the reasons we need to approach this intersection of human mobility and loss and damage in this holistic way is because these forms of mobility are so related. As both Steve and my presentation illustrated, planned relocations can be a form of internal displacement when they're not well carried out. They can also be a way to avert some of the high costs, the high losses and damages of displacement. But when you simply say human mobility equals loss and damage, you miss that nuance, you miss that understanding that there's actually all of these different decisions that we, as planners, as government officials, as academics, shaping narratives around this discourse, as NGOs working to support these communities directly, all of these decisions, and it's not just semantics, right? The words we use have really concrete implications for the policies and practices that are carried out. So I think having this holistic conversation around all the different forms of human mobility and how they relate to loss and damage gives us more of a toolbox of ways of thinking about these relationships and more agency in how they're these various policies and practices are conceptualized and how communities get access to funds and practice. And at the end of the day, what Steve shared rings true. This is about making sure programs and access to funds meet the community's needs so that they can either move or stay in a dignified way.
Yes, thank you so much, Erica. Then I give the final word to Lucy on this question, and maybe also good for everyone to know that Lucy is right now doing a Marie Curie project with the University of Vienna and looking at the links between loss and damage and human mobility. So I'm sure you have something to add as well.
Oh, thanks so much, Darius. I will actually start the research next year. So
Okay.
apologies if I don't come up with anything anything to kind of feel defining for now. But yeah, this has been definitely a really insightful panel also for me, exactly for this reason as well. And at the beginning, you said how it is important to explore how loss and damage is connected to different forms of mobility. And I suppose also reflecting on what Steve and Erica said, for me, it's kind of also about how loss and damage connects different forms of mobility as well. And I think in terms of enabling that choice, enabling those supportive policies and enabling kind of conditions, I think that's super important to also understand that. And then of course also kind of applying loss and damage as an analytic lens as well, increasingly in this space. And I feel like very often, maybe, especially I guess maybe in a context of migration, it's more still sort of seen as a political debate or an object, as you mentioned. But I think it's really important to kind of expand this body of research and evidence exactly to enable these populations who are maybe like more likely to be left to their own devices, because migration, after all, is an autonomous form of adaptation, to gain access to support through, for instance, the loss and damage fund. So I think that's kind of maybe where I see the importance and opportunities. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Lucy. We now have about 25 minutes still for questions from the audience. So there's two ways to ask us questions. One of them is, as people have already been doing, so typing them in the Q&A box. This will mean that I will read them myself. Another way is to raise your hands, and then you will be unmuted and you can actually ask your question yourself instead of me paraphrasing what you have typed. So feel free to do either. I will start with some of the chat that are still open. So Una Murray, you asked a question. You typed, you wondered how we can get others, such as governments, local officials, foundations, donors, and others to think about relocation, migrations, and other forms of human mobility, as well as immobility using a loss and damage lens. And I think we can just put this question to any of you. So whoever wants to start can start with this. But yeah, do you have any reflections on how this can be possible? Yes, Stephen.
Yeah, I was answering a question that Paul asked previously about, the question, it was a really great question that, are we in danger of putting human mobility in a fund, the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage, which barely has any funding? And, and that could be a risk, I suppose. And in answering that, I was reminded, of course, as I teach my students, we could differentiate between loss and damage capital, L and D, within the UNFCCC, and small L and D, loss and damage, which actually refers to what's happens on the ground, not the fund. And I think this discussion or this discourse around loss and damage is really powerful for two reasons. The first is that it does point to polluter responsibility. This absolutely began as a discussion around reparations and polluter responsibilities. And second, someone that has worked in displacement in non-environmental areas of displacement as well, displaced people don't have much visibility. And I have seen in the last couple of years just the visibility of the needs of displaced people and the human rights issues associated with that has been elevated in our discourse because of this discussion of loss and damage. So it's given badly needed visibility to people who have been displaced in the context of climate change. So I think governments are quite receptive to that, but there needs to be funding.
Yes, Erica, I see you have something to add to Stephen here.
Yeah, rereading Una's question, I think it's also about the how. How do we get these stakeholders to take this framing seriously? And I thought a lot about this question in work with Human Rights Watch that's less academic and more action oriented. I think storytelling plays a really critical role, and storytelling that's led by relocating community leaders themselves or displaced persons themselves or migrants themselves is so powerful here to shift the needle and to show the not only are these happening, but also to emphasize the loss and damage angle as opposed to an adaptation angle or a more developmental angle. Um, I think poetry, visuals, media, mixed media, and ultimately just lived experience is one of the most powerful ways to shift these narratives and to emphasize the very real losses and damages, lowercase l, lowercase d, that are happening and will continue to do so.
Yes, great. Thank you, Erica. I see, Lucy, you also have something to add.
Yeah, maybe just very briefly, and actually what you said, Erica, it just made me think of this as well, and I guess also reflecting on what Steve said. So I guess, yes, of course, funding is a major challenge. And I guess maybe there is an opportunity to also scale down. So thinking big to going like thinking small in terms of, like those sort of more intermediary actors or policy processes where there is an opportunity also to shift the needle on this. And it also reminds me of work, again, we've done in Bangladesh through empathy building and exactly like this sort of visual storytelling, perspective taking approaches are key to that. So really sort of highlighting, like Erica said, the loss and damage aspect of these mobilities to those actors who may be in positions of power. It might not be at the national scale, it might be at the city level, or they might be working for an organization supporting the communities that we're referring to really use their position of power and engage with this concept to well, I suppose both to kind of help avert and minimize losses and damages, but also to kind of work towards solutions to respond to those that are inevitable, like we've shown in our presentations as well.
Yes, thank you so much, Lucy. Yeah, and I completely agree. Thank you so much for the three contributions that actually connect so well to each other. I see we have still one open question, but I also saw something in a question by both Paul and both Una, which is the term immobility. And if we speak about human mobility, we often talk about planned relocation, we talk about displacements, we talk about migration, but we also talk about immobility. So I thought maybe we can take the opportunity to quickly talk about, okay, how does immobility fits then into all of this? Who would like to have a first stab at this? I could just start with Stephen again, and we could just do the round around again. Yes. Would you mind starting, Stephen?
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I've already spoken about involuntary immobility. That's very different from voluntary mobility. So I'll talk about voluntary immobility. Back to programming, I think supporting the right to stay, and the ability to stay is critical. That has been, a really rich discourse over the last couple of years. It's been really wonderful to see how that has shifted people's minds, and there's more work to do. But I think the research that we've done really highlights this question of ability. It's not just about right, it's the ability to stay and live in dignity, to have the conditions for a good life. Another sort of twist to this discussion is not just the ability, but it's why should we support the right to stay? Very practically, in looking at the context where we've done our research, because other options are not available. there are very few, for poor people who can't fund their own autonomous relocation, there aren't options to migrate with dignity. And planned relocation is not available at scale. And so supporting this right to stay is an absolute necessity, perhaps as we scale up and build out the capacity to do more planned relocation and to support migration with dignity. But for now, I think really some priority has to go around enabling the ability for people to stay if they choose so. And so, you know, there's a lot in that, how you go about doing that, climate change adaptation, disaster risk reduction. Lucy and colleagues at FAO and UNU have done some marvelous work around the development of rural livelihoods, which is highly applicable to this. But I would like to see a lot of effort in this, supporting the ability to stay.
Yes, thank you, Stephen. Erica?
Yeah, I'll just say that every person who's been involved in a planned relocation that I've ever spoken to has wanted to stay, has preferred to stay. It's the universal perspective, obviously. That's why we say planned relocation is a measure of last resort. Only after all adaptation measures in place have been exhausted. You've built the seawall, you've put house on stilts, and still there's no other choice. Who decides? Who gets to make that decision, and with what evidence? These are really important questions. I think planned relocation has a somewhat different relationship with immobility than either migration or displacement, in part because it's often designed intentionally for involuntarily immobile populations. So it's initiated at a moment when either the community themselves or an external stakeholder, maybe a government, says, okay, this group is involuntarily immobile. They don't have the resources, they don't have the land, they don't have the ability to move yet. Okay, this is the moment when the planning process begins and the collective decision-making happens. There are also circumstances where, as I mentioned already in my presentation, even though a community has reached that threshold and decided this measure of last resort to plan a relocation to a new site, a community isn't homogeneous. A considerable portion of that group may decide to remain. And in fact, in the Gardi Sagdab case study that I've referenced, that was the case. So then it becomes, okay, how do you support populations in two locations? Do you still have access to electricity, access to water? Do you still have schools and hospitals on the origin site for those who voluntarily choose to be immobile, who choose to remain? And it raises questions about how long. Maybe you do that today, but what happens in 5 years, in 10 years, in 100 years? So I think there's a lot of complexity here. And what's most important to take away from this intervention is that everyone should have the option. It's about choice, it's about agency, it's about a right to self-determination for Indigenous communities, so that they can choose to either remain or to move with access to resources and services in a dignified way. Thanks.
Yes, thank you, Erica. Lucy, do you have still anything to add on this?
Well, it's very difficult to follow these brilliant interventions from Stephen and Erica, so I will try. I guess for me, maybe to add, and again, I come from a more migration angle, but also listening to Steve and Erica, I suppose what strikes me is also this point I also made in my presentation of loss and damage being experienced at times at the intersection of mobility and immobility. So whether that's migration and immobility, people who remain, and I guess in terms of enabling that choice, enabling that right to stay for those who want to stay, but also to continue living with dignity and adapting in their places when maybe a portion of the community may have moved. I think it's also important to kind of bridge these silos of not just sort of looking at what can we do with people who have migrated in their destinations and people states. So also bridging, I suppose, the kind of divide between mobility and immobility. And I guess that's what we also try to do in this panel as well. So we try to really reflect that in our respective interventions, how these different forms of mobilities, they cannot be divorced from voluntary or involuntary forms of immobility. So a humble kind of conclusion to two fantastic interventions from Erica and Stephen.
Yes, fantastic. Thank you, Lucy. And I see that Paul has their hand up, so perhaps we could unmute Paul so they can actually ask the questions themselves. Yes, so I see Paul is here,
can you
and
hear
yeah,
me now?
Paul, yeah.
Great. So thank you for this wonderful presentation, wonderful discussion. I come at these things a lot from a programmatic perspective, and I am just kind of noticing that across the adaptation space, and now a bit with loss and damage, it's hardly even got started. I see incredible variation in efficiency and implementation. I see the implementation structures are so diverse and problematic. And the question of reduction of vulnerability, I think, is an analytically central question, and the efficient reduction of vulnerability that is largely absent from the programmatic, World Bank, Global Environment Facility, et cetera, field. And yet, which I think is absolutely critical. And we talk about, they spend $1 million per person in Louisiana, wonderful, and it still fails for displaced people. And then we have, I know you know the data here, but it seems to me that there are really important analytic questions here about how resources, how we come to grips with the efficient allocation of resources to reduce vulnerability, to avoid harm, that are inevitable, but have to be faced and are not being adequately faced, and that it applies in so many areas, but it applies most centrally or very centrally in this question of displacement. And I think that the research that the four of you are doing is, very central to this, but it needs to go further.
Thank you so much, Paul. Yes, so who wants to have a first go at this? If there is no volunteer, I could volunteer. Stephen again? Yes, that's just okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's a big question, and I think there's a lot in there that maybe I'm not equipped to answer, but I am equipped to think about. So thank you very much. So there is a lot of great work being done on climate change adaptation around the world, particularly from a community that identifies itself as community-based adaptation practitioners or locally led adaptation practitioners who identify and in fact created these principles for locally led adaptation. It's really good work that definitely addresses vulnerability and empowerment of people within a community and communities themselves that have been disenfranchised. They do terrific work in reducing vulnerability. And unfortunately, there's a little bit of a silo here because very few within those communities have applied a human mobility lens. And I think that's really sad because I think a lot of their work is well positioned for that. And within the mobility community, if we are a community, rarely talk about these principles for locally led adaptation, which are very specific principles and practices for approaching adaptation and vulnerability reduction. And so I'm not answering your question, Paul, about funding, but I would say there is some very good work. The funding around this is quite efficient and quite impactful. that we can build on, I think, and extend into so with a mobility lens into, I think, the question that you're getting at. And I'll leave the million-dollar question to Lucy and Erica and to Dawe. How's that?
Maybe Erica can give a first attempt.
There's so many layers to this question. I think one that I just want to highlight here is when we think about vulnerability, we also have to think about why, the root causes, the historical context. And just building on this particular example that I keep mentioning in Panama, why was this indigenous community living on a small island very far from the mainland, several kilometers off the coast? Well, it's because of historical colonial forces, interventions to make indigenous people stop wearing their traditional clothing, go to schools where only Spanish was taught, etc. Also, some pirates, and there's a very complex story for why they're living on this particular island. But what you see here is that we can't just think about vulnerability and, frankly, also exposure in terms of today. We need to look at these historical determinants. I think once you take that lens, then you see more opportunities to build more proactive policy interventions that give, perhaps from a reparative justice lens, Indigenous communities unique access to funding for relocation or other durable solutions to displacement. That's just one more way we can think about this, but it's a great question and one that we all will continue to ponder, I'm sure.
Yes, thank you, Erica. Lucy?
Thank you again. Always difficult to follow is the third person, but I suppose maybe one reflection that I would like to add is also, and I guess we see this even in some of the kind of political discussions, right, on the loss and damage, but also in adaptation, etc. Very often I think vulnerability also is used as kind of this blanket category, right? Like, but vulnerability is much more nuanced and differentiated, right? So, for instance, you have this kind of tendency to list out vulnerable populations, e.g., women, children, etc. But when you kind of look at more deeply, so I've been doing also some work with UNICEF on this loss and damage in children, you can see the unique vulnerabilities that different groups might be facing, exactly like Erica said, because of different sort of past kind of historical legacies, but also even because of their present situation of where they are in their life stage and developmental stage, etc., and dependence on adults for care. So I think when you then apply vulnerability as this blanket category, it can translate into maybe sort of blanket interventions that aren't maybe effective or efficient for really addressing the differentiated vulnerabilities and the nuances within that. So maybe that's just a small addition from me. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Lucy. I quickly also want to comment on this. First of all, we had a comment by Jocelyn that just moved columns. Let me check. Yeah, so just Jocelyn, you also answered Paul's question and you talked about the global goal of adaptation, which is currently being negotiated also under the UNFCCC. And the goal of this indeed is kind of vulnerability reduction measurements. And I see, Erica, you agree. Yeah, so I want to comment to this also a little bit from my own research. I don't research human mobility so much. I look at loss and damage. And for me, I'm now really looking at the older disaster literature from the 70s, 80s, and they talk so much already about vulnerability there. There are these kind of Marxist-inspired disaster scholars who talk a lot about the role of the state in creating vulnerability. And I think that's maybe one of the most interesting questions we have also regarding this, is that, of course, a state is often very much responsible in creating vulnerability, but then also through these mechanisms, such as the Loss and Damage Fund, these are all national programs in which the state plays a major role, right? So we have the state on one side as a perpetrator and at some point also as a savior. And I think that's maybe a tension that is quite hard to navigate with a lot of these mechanisms, is that how can you ask a state to address vulnerability and reduce vulnerability if they themselves, to some extent, have a role in creating this vulnerability. Yeah, so that is some input from my side. I see we have about 4 minutes left, which is not so much. I'm still quickly going to ask a question and ask for some quick answers. So, and sorry if I mispronounced it, but Tommy, you ask a question, how do we navigate the dilemmas that come with voluntary immobility if at times evidence shows that there might be impending risks of loss and damage in the future? Can the support offered in voluntary immobility context be sufficient and not lead to further dependencies? So I'm again going to ask Stephen maybe to start with this and then go to Erica and Lucy. And again, we don't have so much time anymore, so perhaps we should much the time a little bit.
Yeah, in our report, we talk about the great work that the NGO Friendship has done in the sort of Sandbar Island context in Bangladesh, where people live in incredible situations of multiple displacements, many displacements over a lifetime. And their work allows displaced people to sort of go home or create a new home quickly and stay there in dignity until the next displacement. Why would one ever want to do that? And I think the answer is it gives people choice. It gives people the opportunity to avoid ending up and having to bring their children to an informal urban settlement that is highly erosive. And so eventually that may not be an option, but they've been doing this work for 20 some years. They've enabled a couple of generations of young people to grow up in a more dignified area. And so I think that I would just put that out as an example of why one might want to do this.
Thank you, Stephen. Erica?
Yeah, Tommy, this is an excellent question. One way that this manifests, one dilemma that's manifested that I've heard from a lot of government officials, if you give voluntary and mobile populations the resources to stay, and then another storm comes, and then there's an expectation that they will be evacuated and that various members of the state will be responsible for providing life-saving assistance in that moment, that might actually put those authorities carrying out the evacuation, it might put their lives at risk. So it's a lot of resources and time. So how do we navigate these dilemmas? This is a question that we interrogated in a paper that's more academic titled Navigating Justice Dilemmas in Managed Retreat. It's hard to distill these arguments succinctly here, but I'll just say, I think dialogue is one way, making sure all stakeholders have a seat at the table and are part of the decision making. And that's not tokenistic, it's genuine. I think that's part of the way we navigate these dilemmas. Infinite resources is the other, which is of course non-realistic, but I think allocating more funding to support these communities and to support people who are carrying out these life-saving evacuation activities is another part of the picture. I'll end there, but it's a great question. There's a lot more to unpack.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Erica, and then Lucy, yeah, for the last input basically of this session.
Sure, I'll be really brief, just also in the interest of time. So I guess, yes, it is a major dilemma, and these are all valid points. But I suppose exactly like giving people the choice, this choice to move with dignity, the choice to also decide when it's the right time, I think is important, because already in the context of loss and damage in particular, that choice has been taken away on so many levels. So I suppose that is also, I guess, an element of maybe restorative justice, so restoring people's dignity, where that's maybe already been lost through other kind of areas of their lives. So I guess it's also maybe a bit of a moral debate as well, that I don't have a perfect answer to, and I think it's very difficult to have a perfect answer to, but hopefully that's kind of leaves us on a bit of a conclusion. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Lucy. And indeed, I think it leaves a bit of a conclusion. I think what we did really well in this session is to indeed explore all the linkages, but also all the challenges that are still there regarding adaptation, loss and damage, vulnerabilities, voluntary immobility. So I quickly want to leave it at this. I see there are still 3 open questions. So Heather, Crispin, and Heather, thank you for the compliment. Crispin and Evelyn, yeah, sorry that we just didn't have time for this. I am sure that everyone's email address will be easily found on their institutional page. So I think also if you have some questions, please feel free to reach out to us. Yeah, and regarding this, then I would like to close the session and maybe thank Stephen, thank Erica, thank Lucy, but also everyone, all the participants, and thank you for all the questions that made it possible to have a truly interactive session. So yeah, have a nice day, everyone.
And thank you, Dawe, for moderating.
Thank you, Dawe.
Yeah.
Thank
Thank you, Dawe. Thank you all.
Yes,
Oh,
thank
thank
you.
you all. Nice.